On a bitter January night in 1958, in a Chicago restaurant that smelled of garlic, cigar smoke, and inevitability, the most dangerous sound in the room wasn't a gun or a shout, but the whisper of paper sliding across polished wood, a blank check placed gently in front of Dean Martin by Sam Giancana, the man who didn't ask and didn't forgive, the man whose reach extended through unions, casinos, police precincts, and whispered all the way to Washington. And as the check came to rest near Dean's untouched scotch, the room seemed to hold its breath because everyone understood what it meant. This wasn't an offer, it was ownership, a polite way of saying you belong to us now. But Dean Martin didn't reach for the pen, didn't flinch, didn't even look impressed. Instead, he took his time, inhaled his cigarette like a man savoring his last calm moment on earth, lifted his glass, drank, and then said something so quiet and absurd it stunned the room into silence. "The ink's too heavy." And in that instant, the power dynamic cracked, because Giancana had dealt with fear his whole life, but never indifference, never a man who genuinely did not need what he was offering. And that was Dean's secret. He wasn't bluffing, he wasn't brave in the heroic sense, he was simply free, shaped by years in the shadows of Steubenville dealing cards in back rooms, boxing for grocery money, watching men like Giancana break others over debts and ego, learning early that bosses only mattered if you needed them. And now, as America's most beloved entertainer, he still didn't. Because fame to him was a job, not oxygen. And when Giancana threatened to erase him, to kill his records, his bookings, his life, Dean calmly explained that he'd already lived without applause and could do it again. That happiness didn't come from marquees or mob protection, that the one thing he wouldn't sell was his word. And that confession, spoken without drama, terrified the most powerful gangster in Chicago, because you cannot control a man who is willing to walk away from everything. And after a long, dangerous silence, Giancana laughed, tore the check to pieces, and dismissed him. Not as a subordinate, but as an equal, because respect in that world wasn't bought with money, but earned through steel nerves and self-possession. And when Dean finally stepped back into the freezing night, legs shaking, heart pounding, he understood how close he'd come to dying, yet also what he'd gained, a reputation that even the mob honored. Because from that night on, they knew they could do business with Dean Martin. But they could never own him, and that moment reveals a truth that still matters today. Real power isn't leverage, money, or fear. It's the ability to say no and mean it, to value dignity over comfort, to walk away when the price is your soul. And in a world that teaches us to chase approval at any cost, Dean Martin reminds us that the strongest position is detachment, the courage to refuse the blank check, the wisdom to know that your word is heavier than ink, and the rare strength to leave the table alive with nothing but yourself intact. And the strangest part was what happened after, because Dean Martin didn't become a legend that night by shouting or posturing or threatening. He became one by leaving, by stepping out into the cold and choosing anonymity over submission. And in the days that followed, something subtle but profound shifted in the underworld of entertainment, because word traveled the way it always did in mob circles, quietly, indirectly, through drivers and bartenders and men who didn't write things down. And the story wasn't that Dean Martin had insulted Sam Giancana, it was that he had survived him without bending, and that distinction mattered more than any act of violence ever could, because power respects limits only when they are enforced. And Dean had enforced his without raising his voice or asking for permission. And back in Las Vegas, Jack Entratter noticed something too, because contracts that could have mysteriously unraveled didn't. Radio stations that could have gone silent didn't. Doors that could have closed stayed open, not out of kindness, but calculation, because killing Dean Martin would have created heat Giancana couldn't afford, and breaking him would have required leverage that simply didn't exist. And that realization unnerved men who built their lives on leverage. Because Dean had none to take, his money didn't own him, his fame didn't define him, his reputation didn't trap him, and that made him dangerous in a way bullets never could, because he was unafraid of loss. And fear is the currency of control, and Dean Martin refused to spend it. So instead of punishing him, they adapted. They dealt with him on his terms, quietly, respectfully, the way one deals with a force of nature you cannot intimidate. And years later, when Dean finally did sing at Giancana's club, it was because he chose to, not because he was summoned. And everyone in the room understood the difference, understood that this wasn't obedience, but a favor. And favors given freely carry more weight than orders ever could. And while Frank Sinatra continued orbiting the mob's approval, chasing validation from men who never truly gave it, Dean floated above it all, detached, amused, unbothered, showing up on stage with a drink in his hand and a smile that hid a spine of pure steel, and the public never knew how close they came to losing him that winter night in Chicago, never knew how thin the line was between legend and obituary, but the men who mattered knew, and they remembered, and that memory followed Dean for the rest of his life, granting him a strange immunity that no lawyer or bodyguard could provide, because even killers understand rules. And one of those rules is simple. You don't mess with the man who isn't bluffing, and this is where the story stops being about mobsters and singers and becomes something uncomfortably personal. Because most of us will never sit across from a man like Sam Giancana, but we will all face blank checks of our own, moments when compromise is dressed up as opportunity, when selling a piece of ourselves seems harmless because the reward is so large and the consequences so distant. And in those moments, the world will tell us we're foolish to say no, unrealistic, arrogant, ungrateful, and Dean Martin's example doesn't promise safety or success. It promises something rarer: integrity, the kind that lets you sleep at night even when your hands are shaking, the kind that allows you to walk away without applause and still know who you are. Because when Dean leaned against that brick wall in the Chicago alley, heart racing, sweat freezing on his skin, he wasn't celebrating. He was reckoning with the cost of freedom, and he paid it gladly, because freedom isn't comfort, it's choice, and the power to choose no, even when yes would be easier, richer, safer in the short term. And that's why decades later, this story still matters, why it lingers, why it refuses to fade into trivia. Because beneath the smoke and suits and mythology is a simple, dangerous truth. The moment you prove you can walk away, you become untouchable, and the moment you realize that, you stop being afraid. And that was Dean Martin's real legacy, not the voice, not the rat pack, not the swagger, but the quiet refusal that echoed louder than any gunshot ever could. And yet the real aftermath of that night didn't happen in Chicago. It happened quietly in the weeks and years that followed, in phone calls that never came, favors that were never asked, doors that strangely stayed open when they should have slammed shut. Because word traveled fast in that world and the story hardened into legend. Dean Martin couldn't be bought, couldn't be frightened, couldn't be owned, and that made him more dangerous than any gangster in the room. So when he returned to Vegas and stepped onto the stage at the Sands, smiling easy, drink in hand, the audience had no idea they were watching a man who had just stared into the machinery of absolute power and walked away intact. And the mob knew something else too, that if they pushed him again, he'd disappear without drama, without bitterness, and that kind of man is bad for business. Because leverage only works on those who cling, and Dean never clung to anything. Not fame, not money, not even applause. Which is why he aged differently than his peers, why he could joke about quitting tomorrow, why he slept at night while others drank themselves hollow chasing validation from men who would never give it. And decades later, when was gone, Sinatra was haunted, Vegas was corporatized, and the old underworld had rotted from the inside. That single moment still stood as a quiet rebellion, A reminder that dignity doesn't announce itself. It doesn't shout or threaten, it simply refuses, and that refusal echoes longer than gunfire. Because the blank check wasn't just money, it was a test, and Dean Martin passed it by, understanding the one rule that outlives every empire. The only thing no one can take from you is the life you're willing to live without their permission. The legend followed him forever, whispered in back rooms and casino corridors, a quiet warning that Dean Martin couldn't be bought or broken. And when the mob spoke his name, it wasn't with ownership but awe. Because in a world ruled by fear, the man who needed nothing was the most dangerous of all.